Hi, my name is Robert Daly. I direct the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Very glad to be back in Steamboat. My first trip here was in 2019, 5 years ago. And at that point, I told the seminar that U.S. China relations were not yet a Cold War. I'm coming back today to say that it is a Cold War, and it's been a Cold War for several years, and so a great deal has changed. And I'm going to talk with the group about how I think it is likely to end and what we should be aiming at.
Good evening and welcome to the continuation of the 22nd season of seminars at Steamboat. And tonight we present our 96th seminar in our history. I'm Walt Abbott, I'm the seminar's chair, and I'm very pleased to have you here with us tonight. Immediately following this evening's presentation, as you know, there'll be the usual Q&A session with the speaker. You can ask your questions by opening your smartphone. Before you do that, I'm going to ask you all to silence your smartphones. Open your smartphone, go to joinqa.com and enter code 85518 or scan the QR code on the back of the program. The seminar's board members want to express our sincere thanks to the sponsors and volunteers who make the series possible. We especially want to recognize today's sponsor, which is the city of Steamboat Springs. Along with the supporting sponsors, Kate and Malcolm Hawk, and Susan Larson. Thank you, thank you. I'm sure you know that there is never a charge of admission to come to any seminar. But to make that happen, we depend on your donations, which account for nearly 90% of our operating costs. I'm glad to say that this year we're making great progress toward meeting our goals, but we're not quite there yet, so keep us in mind. No donation is too small. And of course, there are multiple ways you can donate. You can go to the website, seminars@steamboat.org. You can use Venmo by searching in the charities section, or you can do the old-fashioned way, you can write us a check. Video recordings of all seminars are available by going to the seminar's website or by searching on YouTube. As you know, closed captioning is available now both in English and Spanish. So please share the link to these recordings with your friends and colleagues. Spread the word. Podcasts of all seminars are available courtesy of KUNC Public Radio of Northern Colorado. Go to their website, kunc.org, where you can get not only the podcast, but also the videos. Look at the shows and podcasts section. I have two brief announcements. One, as you know, Best of the Boat voting is going on now, so please keep us in mind. You can vote by going to steamboatpilot.com/best. You have to look in the community section and then the nonprofit subsection. And like certain other places in the country, you can vote often. You can vote once a day, every day. This is legitimate. Once a day, every day until August 16th is the last day. Secondly, believe it or not, but next week, the seminar's board will be meeting to map out the 2025 program. We invite you to submit ideas and submissions for topics that we may want to include next year. You can do that by sending us an email. Do that at seminars@steamboat, all one word, @gmail.com. Be sure to give us a title and a couple of sentences as to why you think it is a pressing public policy issue. And now, here to introduce this evening's speaker is seminar's board member, Erin Litzy. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our fourth seminar of the 2024 season. We are thrilled to welcome back Robert Daly, a leading authority on U.S. China relations and the current director of the Kissinger Institute on China in the U.S. at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This is Robert's second time speaking at seminars, and as a lifelong local, I like to think he may have finally caught that Yampa Valley curse. In 2019, Robert spoke to us at seminars questioning whether or not the U.S. and China could, quote unquote, step back from the brink. Now, 5 years later, tensions have only seemed to escalate, with China engaging in aggressive foreign and defense policy while power continues to consolidate under President Xi. The U.S. and our allies are working to adapt to the shift in China's policy and increasingly confrontational actions, with a clear and increasing threat in the South China Sea and beyond. There is no one better who can help shine a light on all the nuances in this complicated relationship than Robert Daly. In addition to his current role as the director of the U.S. China relations at the Kissinger Institute, Robert Daly has been a diplomat, a professor of Chinese, an interpreter for both U.S. and foreign leaders, as well as a cultural ambassador working on several television and theater projects in China as a host, actor, and writer. We got to hear about his time working on Sesame Street for China last night at dinner. So let's give Robert a warm welcome back to seminars.
Thank you. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be back in Steamboat Springs and to be with all of you. I'm going to set my timer. Walt gave me very clear instructions, and so I want to make sure that I do not go a minute too late, so that we have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you give me just 1 second to do that. We are in business. Well, great to be back here. As was mentioned, I was here in 2019, and we spoke then about whether we could pull back from the brink at a time when U.S.-China relations seemed to be getting worse and worse almost by the week. It has continued to seem like such a time almost every week since 2019. I said then that this was a competitive relationship, but that it was not yet a Cold War. And per Walt's suggestion at the beginning of the talk, I have come now with the grim news that, yes, we are in fact already engaged in a new kind of Cold War. I don't mean that as an analogy. I don't mean it as a threat. I think that it is the best description, the best framework for understanding the constant rain of news you hear about China and U.S.-China relations. I know that it's depressing to hear that it's a Cold War again. It sounds retrograde. We thought this was in the rearview mirror. We thought we were better than this. And I think that every morning's news suggests that we are not. This Cold War began as a competition between the United States and China, but the scope is now wider than that. Now, neither side uses that term. President Biden is very, very careful. Anytime he or one of his advisors gives a major China speech, they begin by saying, now, we don't want to engage in a Cold War. That's your tell, right? This is Hillary Clinton standing up saying, no, I don't want to, I'm not here standing by my man. Oh? Why are you here exactly? It's always the giveaway that you get right up front. And of course, the Biden administration doesn't want to say that it's a Cold War because it doesn't want to scare people, and it doesn't want to provoke a lot of questions that it can't answer. Like, how dangerous is it? How long will it last? What's this going to cost us? What's the threat? They don't know that. So they avoid using that language, but it's clearly the correct framework. The Chinese side hates this phrase even more. They've weaponized it. Almost any time an American makes any statement that China doesn't like, they'll say, well, you have a Cold War mentality. You have a Cold War mentality. This is the kind of criticism I think that we have to reject. If it's raining outside, and I say that it's raining, I do not have a rainy day mentality. I recognize precipitation, right? You have to begin with the facts. So this Cold War II, as I've come to think of it, sets the global West, by which I mean all developed democracies, in growing opposition not only to China, but to Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other nations that are increasingly working in concert. And what draws these nations together is not a common political program or even an identical form of government. They're not unified by common culture or similar systems. What does unify them, and you hear this from Putin and Xi Jinping especially, is a very strong desire not to have their choices shaped by the West, and not to have their nations defined morally before the world by an international media that they see as largely dominated by the United States. And I would posit that this isn't hard to understand. You know, they don't want these are proud nations, in some cases like Russia and China, ancient civilization states, who don't want their world shaped by us. They also tend to share a preference for authoritarianism over the rule of law. So when I say these things about China and Russia, just to be clear at the outset, and I'm going to have to sit down. I went hiking, I went to a uranium mine today, and I can hike forever, I can walk forever. The one thing my knees will not let me do is stand still for 40 minutes. So I'm going to take a seat. I hope you'll excuse me. So I'm talking about the governments of China, Iran, and Russia, not the civilizational achievements of these countries, which in China and Russia and Iran are very, very great. And we have a tremendous amount to learn from the study of these civilizations. I know that my now nearly 40-year study of China has enriched my life in every way. I've learned tremendously from China. I continue to learn from China. So I do not want to come here to Steamboat and simply be seen as attacking China. The scholar Jacques Barzun said that the first time he read Dostoevsky, he felt like a savage watching the sunrise. And that was the way I felt the first time I saw a master Chinese calligrapher wield the brush, this art form that we don't have. Mind, body, instrument, ink, paper, achieve something that we simply don't do for the most part in the arts in the West. And that was only one of many eye-opening or savage seeing the sunset experiences that China has given me. And I want to acknowledge that from the beginning because I gather many of you have been to China. Am I right? Can I see hands? Okay, so probably not for a while, but many of you. And so you felt the energy, the fantastic hospitality, the justified pride, and I'm sure that you had a lot of fellow feeling when you went there. So this has been my experience with the people of China, with their language, their arts, their modes of thinking, and I remain, based on that experience, an engager when I look at China. When I say it's a Cold War, I'm not a hawk who's been champing at the bit to say this since I was last year with you. This is a tragedy. I wish it had been avoided. It's going to be very costly, but I think it's where we are at the outset. Yes, depressing. Yes, regrettable. But I think Cold War is our best phrase. And in Q&A, if you want to challenge that, we can unpack some of that and talk about why I'm making this claim. So this is going to be a long, dangerous, expensive struggle in which the U.S. and China, together with whatever partners they can muster, try to prevail in what is going to be a global contest to maximize their influence across all dimensions of power. And this is what makes it a Cold War. They want to do that. They want to prevail through all means short of war. The good news in all of this is that both sides are committed to avoiding war if they can. The bad news is they're not yet so committed that they're willing to back down or change any of their views about their own ambitions or about the other. But for now, there's a very strong commitment to avoid war. So against that background, I want to focus on three questions. One, what is the central question in Cold War II? What is at issue? Why are we doing this? Two, what conditions will we have to meet to end the Cold War peacefully? And then three, what kind of dispositions as a people, what kind of strategic dispositions toward our own nation and toward China are we going to need to foster if we're going to end this conflict peacefully? So The new foundation of U.S.-China relations, and I think we know this very clearly since the Biden-Xi Jinping meeting last November, is to avoid war. That's the foundation of the relationship. That's why we deal with each other. In '72, when Nixon and Kissinger went to China, we knew what the foundation was. It was to counter the Soviet Union. That was why this happened. That was how we measured the success of our policy. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the Cold War ended in the early '90s, we never really revisited this question of what the foundation of the relationship was. We continued on autopilot, more or less, but I think that in retrospect, it's easy to see why we had a relationship with China. One of the reasons that we were involved with China was the excitement of it working toward having 1/5 of humankind who had lived in nearly medieval conditions for decades, who had been our enemy in Korea and Vietnam, in seeing them develop and flourish. There was an excitement in that, which is probably the reason that many of you went to China when you went. The second reason we did this, of course, was to profit by it. We had a humanistic, benevolent reason for working with China, but our corporations also wanted to make a good deal of money in China, and they have, not as much as they would have liked. And then the third reason, again, during this period when the Cold War had ended, but this Cold War II had not yet begun, the third reason to be involved with China was to sort of introduce China, to try to Sherpa it into global rules and global systems, with the hope that China would see a benefit to it in upholding those systems as it became more powerful, such that it would be a stakeholder and not a revisionist to those systems. But now, again, the foundation of the relationship is to avoid war. Okay, we want to avoid war, but what exactly is the threat from China that's so dire? How does China see this? In the introduction, you mentioned the ways that China has changed very, very, very accurately in the way that we've wanted to adjust. But of course, China has a beef with us as well. They have a list. China has made a decision that no matter what the United States says, our real China policy is containment, regime change, and support for Taiwan independence. And if that's our real policy, containment, regime change, and support for Taiwan independence, then we pose an existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore, from their point of view, an existential threat to China. From China's point of view, this threat perception of us is reasonable. They can point to very solid evidence. Are we containing China? Absolutely. Absolutely. There's all kinds of evidence of this, but the strongest are the export controls that we have put on semiconductors, semiconductor components, software, tools used to manufacture leading edge semiconductors, the smallest nodes. We're doing everything we can to prevent China from attaining that capability. The reason, I think, is strategically very sound, and I think it's one that most Americans would support. We don't want to sell China any advanced technology that it can use in weapons to target us, right? Reasonable. Lenin said the capitalists will sell us the rope we use to hang them. We're saying, not quite that stupid, not going to do it. And we're working with the Netherlands and Japan and South Korea to make sure that they also don't provide China with these tools that will give it advanced computing and advanced artificial intelligence that will go into weapons. So I think, again, reasonable. If anybody thinks that that's a bad idea, that's a bad principle, please challenge it during the Q&A. The difficulty is that in denying China advanced computing and semiconductors for weapons, we're also denying it to them for everything else. So the next time you read an article about the promise of artificial intelligence, for agriculture, such that you can micro-irrigate every small plant with no waste, for education, for transportation, for cures for cancer, for genomic medicine, all of the things that we're reading about AI's promising, whether or not these promises are true, we as a nation have now said to the people of China, not for you guys, not if we can help it. We have a policy now of denying them further technological and economic development of these sorts. Absolutely containment. Regime change. When he was Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, speaking in 2020 at the Nixon Library, called on the people of China to rise up and overthrow their government. That's regime change. It doesn't matter that we haven't said it since. Other countries are really, they don't have a strong burden of having to understand the niceties and nuance of every new American government. An American government said rise up and overthrow your leaders. And then, are we pushing more independence for Taiwan? Yes, not absolutely, not with full determination, but we've moved considerable distance from our original one China policy. So China sees an existential threat from us, and they see a threat too from our ideas. I think that's true. A threat from sort of the legacy of the Enlightenment, the notion of the primacy of individuals, that's a threat too. But what about the threat to the US? What is it? Is it TikTok? Is it Confucius Institutes? Is it, what do they call these fast fashion websites? You may not know about these Temu and Shein. Are these really threats to the United States? I'm pretty sure as you move around this beautiful part of the country, you don't feel this oppressive cloud of Chinese threat. So what are we talking about? I was in New York in late April to brief the incoming commander of Indo-PACOM, which is based in Honolulu. You probably know this. They're in charge of all American forces in the Eastern Hemisphere. And I was going to brief him first thing, his name's Admiral Samuel Paparo, the next morning. But I was walking through Central Park, and it was a beautiful late April Thursday. It was warm, it was gorgeous if you know Central Park. It was the perfect Central Park vista. People from all over America and all over the world, all just delighting themselves in whatever way that they thought best. And it was really uplifting, and I felt I had to ask the question. Because we're speaking about a threat from China, we're talking about a Cold War. Looking at this beautiful human scene, the question is, does China threaten this? Right? Does China hate this? Does China want to see this burn? And of course, the answer is no. It's absurd. China doesn't want that. And there are equally delightful scenes that we could all see in China that we do not wish to destroy. Are we worried about the spread of Chinese ideas in America? Can anybody here name one? Are you aware of this? I'm not. You know, Chinese influence? Where? I think that most Americans are baffled when they hear this. But I think that there is a threat, and the threat comes from the growing and intense competition to shape what's sometimes called world order, which is a grandiose phrase, it's overused, to shape global systems, the norms and values that underlie them, to shape international organizations. These organizations, these systems, whether we're aware of them or not, shape the lives of individual human beings and are therefore a concern for all of us. Of course, if we say that we want to focus on the global order competition, there's a danger, which is that the US has been preeminent worldwide since 1945. We've become accustomed to it. We like our preeminence. It makes us feel secure. Many of us probably view it as part of the natural order of things. And we have in fact come to associate our global preeminence with our security. It is American policy that we cannot allow the rise of any regional hegemon. This is a very important policy that many Americans aren't aware of. We cannot allow any country, any nation to be more powerful in its neighborhood than we are. In its neighborhood, not in our neighborhood. That's our policy. So we've come to associate that, our preeminence, with security. Is a threat to that global preeminence a threat to our security? Is that how we want to think about it? This is one of the questions we have to ask. And of course, it's true, China says this, and they're right, that we fear losing our preeminence. And I think that that fear might warp our judgment regarding what kind of order is possible, what kind of order is just, or what kind of order is sustainable in a complex world where power is now much more diverse and much more diffuse than it has been before. A world in which we are increasingly going to feel that we are in fact only 5% of the human population. And we have enjoyed a far greater share of almost everything than our 5% would indicate. There is now power in more countries.
Medium-sized and even smaller countries have far more power than they did during the first Cold War. Corporations, international non-governmental organizations, international media, even potentially an individual who's a really wonderful blogger has more influence. That there's a diversity of types of influence. Influence is more diffuse. Are we going to be able to maintain the kind of preeminence that we've enjoyed in this very, very different world? China, moreover, claims, I think with considerable justification, there's a problem which we'll get to in a minute, but I find the first part of China's argument pretty hard to counter. They're saying that they're simply doing what any country would try to do under their circumstances, and that is to translate wealth into power internationally. How do you translate wealth into power? Every country wants to push its defensive perimeters outward. As I've mentioned, we pushed ours outward until they've comprised the entire globe, right? China also wants to push its defensive perimeters outward and do, in effect, the sorts of things that the United States wanted to do. China also, when you ask China what it wants, and this is a big question, as this vast country gets more wealthy, what do you want? China doesn't really speak about what it wants. It speaks about its rights. It says, we, like every other country, have a right to sovereignty. And that sovereignty includes not only our sacred territory, but our right to pick our own kind of government is also a sovereign right. And therefore, your critiques of our Chinese Communist Party are illegitimate and are a threat to our sovereignty. They say we have a right to development. We have a right to human flourishing. Of course, that's true. So how do we feel? How does this audience feel about American policies designed to limit that flourishing? It's a very serious question. We have a right to, our people need technology, they need material well-being, they need to import food and energy and raw materials. They have a right to markets, we have a right to development. We have a right, they say also, to security. And not security as you define it, security as we define it. Right? This is an enormous country, a wealthy country. We have a right to security, and we have a right to global participation. Now, I think that all those things are true, right? They're very hard to counter unless you end up where many people in Washington are with, well, yes, but what you, the bad, don't understand is that we are the good. And so it's not such a problem, the current arrangement, but you having that, looms as a problem. Now, I think I'm making fun of it, but there's actually something also to that, which we'll get to in a minute. And China, it's difficult to have these conversations about our mutual ambitions with the Chinese because they speak of their rights and not of their ambitions. There tends to be this assumption in China that they are somehow geopolitically innocent, and that America, as the residence power, is mean and self-dealing. Is China innocent? Geopolitically innocent? Bill Burns, the head of the CIA, has said famously that China is the only US rival with both the intent to reshape the international order and the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to do so. Okay, so this is new, and we talked about this in 2019. We have a peer competitor. We haven't had this before. Now we have a peer competitor, and it's making us very nervous. Should we care about China's reaching out to reshape the international order? Should we care? I think the answer is yes. And the reason that we have to care, and again, I'm talking about this as really the core of this new Cold War, about what is at issue. China's drive to shape global governance means, as our drive meant for us, that China wants to make global systems and values mimic China's domestic systems and values as closely as possible. In other words, they want global governance to be as similar as possible to the Chinese Communist Party's domestic governance within China, not because they're missionaries for communism, but because a global system that welcomes and is similar to their own system will simply give China the greatest scope for action. And that, I think, is a problem. And because China is trying to make the global system more like its own system, we must ask what China's system is and what values it espouses, and what models of human flourishing it advocates. And we have to do this in order to decide whether we want to live in such a world, and if not, how hard we should fight against it. These are the questions that we must ask. I just finished, there's a great new two-volume biography of T.S. Eliot, if you like T.S. Eliot's poetry. And there's a quote of his that he ticked off a bunch of his English friends. He'd become English at this point. At the beginning of World War II, and he said it's really a question not of who wins, but of what wins. Of what wins. And I think that's similar to the point I'm making now. What's at issue when we talk about the global order, the rules, the systems, the values that we are all going to live under, it's really the question is really, how do we want to be human? Is the Chinese Communist Party answer to that question, how should we be human? In Chinese, 何以为人? Is that something that we can accept? So, let's look at some of the facts about China to try to determine how the Communist Party views human flourishing. And please note, I'm about to sort of go full hawk and get kind of nasty on China. And there's a difficulty when you do this that I'm very aware of, which is that there's always a shadow discussion. If I start to say negative things about China, it will sound as though I'm asserting that the United States is perfectly virtuous in the opposite way. Okay, I'm not asserting that. So just please know, I just don't have time to qualify everything I want to say about China out of existence by being introspective and showing that I know American history. So I grant you everything in that department. Let's move past it for now. Okay, I'm not making the opposite arguments about the United States. So what do we see when we look at China domestically? Well, first, and I think that anybody who goes there, what you will notice is just tremendous success. A rise on a scale and at a speed that has never been done anywhere in human history. And you will see amidst this very rapidly changing and flourishing society, you will meet a tremendous number of very admirable people. Hardworking, innovative, entrepreneurial, international in their thinking, quite justifiably proud in China's successes. So let me put that out there first. That's what tends to strike you. But then when you look a little closer, you see the increasingly absolute subservience of individuals and institutions to the state under Xi Jinping, who's now leader for life. You see the hyper-politicization of culture, education, family, neighborhood, the workplace. The hyper-politicization, which again for us raises the question we have to ask. Do we really think that as the Chinese Communist Party's power grows, that they will treat us better than they treat their own people? Once they have the capacity to treat us at all, which right now is very, very limited. And I would not be optimistic on that score. We see increasingly in China abuse of individuals and groups that do not comply with the state. We see China having gone, I assume that most of you who've been to China went during the Deng Xiaoping or Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao era, before Xi Jinping. And during that era, China was an increasingly open developmental state. The trajectories were good, they were encouraging. It was an increasingly open developmental state. Under Xi Jinping, it has become a closed and increasingly ideological security state. He's taken China from soft authoritarianism, which is probably what most of you saw. You probably mostly noticed the soft part. He's taken it to techno-totalitarianism under a surveillance state that you've probably read something about, which is growing. And this is characterized by censorship, xenophobia, and nationalism. Now, if you go to China today, all these very negative things I've just said, you may have cognitive dissonance because there really is a security state. Every single alley and street, certainly in Beijing and in most Chinese cities now, is covered with a CCTV camera that can instantly use facial recognition technology to identify you and to know where you live, whether you have any record of crime or jaywalking, whatever it might be. All of your involvements with the state will be there. All of your purchases will be there. All of your social media contacts will be there. What you said to whom, they have it instantly. And they also have linked these capabilities to what they call predictive policing. It's like the old phrenological idea that criminals have a certain posture and a certain way of walking. And so even if they haven't committed a crime yet, I'm pretty sure you're gonna sometime in the next 2 weeks. I don't know what you're gonna do, but it's be something, right? This is the way that they work. So we expect, when we hear surveillance state, we expect to go somewhere that feels Orwellian, right? Gray people in gray streets kind of skulking like this from the surveillance cameras. And that's not at all what you see when you get to China. Again, you'll see pride and tremendous energy and hard work. So we're dealing with something new. We're dealing with something that will give us a kind of cognitive dissonance. That's domestically. What do we see China doing internationally? First, a major military buildup. And yeah, I know, who are we to speak? Of course, it's a different conversation. But a military buildup in which they're going for full parity in nuclear weapons with the United States. They're building up their conventional, cyber, space forces, I say, as well as their nukes. They have a nuclear triad, meaning they can launch from air, land, and sea. They have increasingly silent nuclear submarines. They have delivery systems that are more advanced than ours, something called hypersonic glide re-entry vehicles, which are particularly nasty, and we can't stop them. One of them recently circumnavigated the globe, and it came up from the south. Because of the legacy of the first Cold War, almost all of our radar arrays point north. So welcome back mutual assured destruction. It never really went away, but it hasn't been in the ether for a long time, the way it was for most of your lives. That's coming back. China has provided absolutely essential support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. They haven't yet, that we've discovered, provided high amounts of lethal aid, but they're aiding Russia rhetorically, economically, technologically, in every other way possible. They're enabling the invasion of Ukraine. They are forming blocs, and again, who are we? With Russia, with Iran, North Korea, Cuba to an extent, Venezuela, getting stronger in the Middle East. They are increasingly aggressive toward Taiwan and toward the Philippines, trying to enforce claims in the Philippines and in the South China Sea, which the International Court of Justice ruled were illegal, had no basis under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 2016. We see them coercing countries economically if they don't like the statements those countries make, and we do see overseas influence campaigns. So from the things that China's government in fact does, despite the many things that we should admire about the Chinese nation today and about its history, I think we can derive the Chinese Communist Party's vision of the human that would probably obtain if they were able to run the table in global systems. The CCP wants the Chinese people to be wealthy, healthy, and educated, especially in STEM fields. It wants the Chinese people to be technologically innovative and enabled. It wants them to be enriched by global markets and resources. It wants them to be proud of China's civilizational achievements and newfound power. It wants them to be entertained. It wants them to feel secure, and this is where it gets tricky, and genuinely satisfied under the protection and direction of an all-powerful state. So the Chinese vision, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party's vision of human flourishing is really that we are homo economicus. That if our material needs, and including things like health and education outcomes, are basically set, we should be satisfied. So we see in China no meaningful political participation for most people, little training in critical thinking in universities, no unhampered creativity, no real freedoms of speech, association, publication, or religion. And then to bring it back to the original point, China requires, the CCP requires an international system or a global order that is supportive of that vision if it is going to continue to function as it has domestically as it becomes a global power. It wants to narrow that gap between global ideas and global systems and China's. And that involves, its vision also involves unchallenged state power without any obstacle or objection placed in the way of the state by civil society. It involves a right to surveil populations and institutions. The Communist Party demands that it and increasingly international organizations as well operate in secrecy. Very much dislikes transparent transaction of global rulemaking. And it believes, as does Russia, as does Iran, as does India, in the old spheres of influence model. We have our country, we have our sphere of influence, leave us alone within that sphere. And again, it's easy enough to understand why they want that, but the whole structure of international law, especially since World War II, comes crumbling down if they're granted that. So that's what this new Cold War is about. And the good news about that is I think if we focus on that, it's manageable. This is within our ken. Don't panic. It's a Cold War, but don't panic about it. We have strong alliances. We have great strength here at home. I think we can probably manage it. Okay, how does it end? What should we anticipate? What should we be aiming for? I think this will be a decades-long struggle, and it's going to be unpredictable. So I'm not offering you a prediction, but a sort of a framework, kind of a way of thinking about an end to constant, intensive rivalry with China, remembering that our overarching goal is to keep the Cold War cold, is not to fight under circumstances when the chances of that conflict are going up. So I think there are 5 conditions that have to be met if we're going to end the Cold War. A Cold War, sort of in its broadest terms, ends when one side or both sides' threat perceptions are lowered, right? Are lowered such that combating the rival power is no longer an organizing principle of government. It's when it ends, lowering of threat perception. So what has to happen for threat perceptions to lower? 1, China must be confident of its ability to develop and uphold its security, but cannot dominate its region. How do we find a way to do that? This is why it takes decades. China is confident of its ability to develop and uphold its security. That's what they get. But cannot dominate its region. That's what everybody else gets. I don't know how we get here, but these, I think, are the minimal conditions. That's 1. Number 2, global systems, the way that the world systems operate, must be sustainably liberal, broadly liberal, transparent, governed by some form of legal framework, and they must be more widely accepted as legitimate. So global institutions are sustainably liberal, that's what we get, but they must be more widely accepted as legitimate. That's what China and other countries get. We can't be quite as dominant as we have been. We cannot just, flout the rules as readily as we can. We have to be open to change and adaptation that is more inclusive, that is an invitation to Africa and Latin America and Central and Southeast Asia to participate and let us know what sort of rules work for them. Number 3, we need a new workable arms control regime, which we do not have right now. China refuses to enter in strategic stability talks with us about how we are going to manage and control our nuclear arsenals and how we are going to try to stop further nuclear proliferation. They won't play, they don't pick up the phone. 4, we need a manageable cross-strait framework. Okay, this new Cold War has a potential flashpoint, has several, but the main one is Taiwan. And we need to get a new set of understandings in place about how we are going to frame Taiwan. That's what Kissinger and Nixon spent a lot of time dealing with. And then lastly, China and the United States, and this is a little abstract, a little tricky, and I'm watching the clock, so I know where we are in time, Walt. China and the United States both have to find a kind of confidence that we both currently lack in our nationhood and our roles in the world. One of the strange things about this new Cold War is that both superpowers are extremely fragile for different reasons. But there's tremendous fragility in the United States and in China. Now, in putting it this way and suggesting that these are the things we aim for, I don't want to suggest that this is easy. We could go to war with China. We could go to war with China. Still a low probability, but not zero, and the probability is going up. I also don't mean to suggest that this Cold War arises from misconceptions. It does not arise from misconceptions. It arises from genuinely incommensurate values and interests, which are exacerbated by ambitions and fears on both sides. We can't wish it away. So then lastly, if this is broadly right, if it's something like a Cold War, and if it ends along the lines I've just described, what sort of national and strategic dispositions will this require? So notice the following about the framework I just put forward. 1, I assume a long timeline. It's going to take decades. That means we are going to need to be gradualists, proportionate, patient. We need to recognize that not all threats are existential. I hear people in Washington saying that China is an existential threat to us now. No, it is not. And they'll say things like it's an existential threat to our values. It's an incoherent, inadmissible phrase. I don't even know what that means. Not every threat is existential. This is something, it comes from the American evangelical character, right? Every battle is Armageddon. But in fact, not every battle is Armageddon. Not every pickpocket is a serial killer. Some of them are just pickpockets, right? So we have this, sort of end of days desire to blow things up. We need to be careful. It's going to be a long-term thing. And this framework also assumes that we do not fight. And if we do not fight, the important question is how much deterrence is enough? We're doing a lot on the deterrence side. 2 Washington think tanks have recently called for putting our American production, the American economy on a wartime footing. Is that really what we want? And we've done this with no talk of guns and butter trade-offs at all, right? Where are the hippies when you need them? They're gone. Where are the Barragans? There are none of these countervailing voices. Ike himself in 1953, the Cross of Iron speech that you've all probably heard, said that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. There's no discussion of this at all in Washington currently. It's all deterrence. Notice also in this framework that neither nation achieves total victory. We're not talking about total victory. So if you're not going for total victory, you don't have to aim at it. You do not have to declare an intention to destroy each other. 2 very influential thinkers on China, Mike Gallagher, who just retired from Congress, and a guy named Matt Pottinger, who sort of ran the Trump China policy. They wrote a recent article in Foreign Affairs in which they said, win, don't manage. They begin where I begin, same premise, it's a Cold War. Win, don't manage. That is Khrushchev saying, we will bury you. If you say we will bury you, that's very different than saying this is going to be a long-term evolution. They're saying we will bury you. Rhetoric matters. Leonardo Sciascia said, even true things shouted from loudspeakers start to sound like lies. And now we're yelling some untrue things through loudspeakers. In this framework, neither government need collapse. So it doesn't have to end that way. Competition will continue, but it's a competition in which we will win some and lose some without every loss involving a 4-alarm fire at the NSC. Therefore, we cannot give up on dialogue, and multilateralism is going to play a very important role. And then the biggest piece, and I want to end on this, is that in this scenario for a Cold War, and if it ends broadly along the lines I described, this is the hardest thing, and this is why it's going to take a long time. Both nations must change. This is something we're not talking about with reference to China. You never hear this. They have to change, we don't. But in fact, if this is going to be a decades-long Cold War, the way we choose to prosecute it will profoundly affect us. Right? Now, some of my more hawkish friends might say, leave that to the historians 50 years hence. I think we're a little smarter than that. I think we know a little more than that. We don't know everything. But we need change. China has to adapt to modernity, which it has never done. We need to adapt to multilateralism, which we are very disinclined to do. But a Cold War is about keeping it cold, right? It's a play for time. Time for what? Time for change. Change in ways that we cannot foresee. Those must be our national dispositions, including an openness to change if we're going to end Cold War II peacefully. And to close, I'd like to close with a quote from the Hawk's favorite hawk, who is, of course, Winston Churchill. And he wrote this in The Gathering Storm in 1948, having seen, obviously, all of World War II and everything else that he saw. Churchill, looking back, wrote, "Those who are prone, by temperament and character, to seek sharp and clear-cut solutions to difficult and obscure problems, who are ready to fight whenever some challenge comes from a foreign power, have not always been right. Those whose inclination is to bow their heads to seek patiently and faithfully for peaceful compromise are not always wrong. On the contrary, in the majority of instances, they may be right, not only morally, but from a practical standpoint. How many wars have been averted by patience and persisting goodwill? Religion and virtue alike lend their sanctions to meekness and humility, not only between men, but between nations. How many wars have been precipitated by firebrands? How many misunderstandings which led to wars could have been removed by temporizing? Temporizing. Churchill wasn't advocating appeasement, right? He's still Churchill. We know that. He was recommending that we get our facts straight, that we use words carefully, that we think twice, that we remain vigilant, and let time do its work in the service of peace. Marilynne Robinson, the American writer, I hope some of you have read Gilead. If not, go out and buy it tomorrow. Said that time is the medium of change, the medium of the transactions among things and conditions. And I think that's what we need. Again, we need to anticipate and plan for change now, not leave it to the historians 50 years from now. Despite the great uncertainty, we know more than that, and I hope we are wiser than that. We better be. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. You mentioned, first and foremost, that it's going to take a lot of patience and a long time. Do you think that both sides have sort of the longevity and the patience to stick with this, to continue to have a Cold War, not a hot war, and to continue to get to some sort of a better relationship between the two countries?
So the clichéic answer is that China is more patient than we because of its antiquity and because it's seen so many turns of the wheel. And I think in general that's true. They are much better at using time as a tool or even a weapon of foreign policy than we are. We tend to think about what we want or what is right and wrong and sort of to want it right now. And they see time somewhat differently and often use it more wisely. At the same time, from their own point of view, they're both the ambitious and the aggrieved party. They're on the move, and they have described very clearly, with great specificity, a window of strategic opportunity that they think they have, in which they must make the big chess moves, and they see that window closing. They might even see it closing now more rapidly than they did about 2 years ago, because, until this morning anyway, the American economy seemed to be doing a lot better than many people thought that it was.
Right.
And so you don't necessarily want to count on China staying its hand. The Chinese believe that they have been very restrained, and they're better at being patient. But maybe more important than that, an advantage they have as a one-party state is they're very good at being consistent.
Right.
So you can't have a long-term policy unless you know you're going to have the same form of governance and that your goals and tactics won't change much. That's what we can't do.
Right.
Because of our political system. If we're going to become a different country every 4 years, or even if we're going to have the kinds of confusion that we tend to be prone to, it's hard for us to be patient, not because we're impatient people, but because it's so hard for us to be consistent as a matter of our political structure.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a lot of questions in the social Q&A, sort of how you would compare and contrast a Trump presidency with Harris. Looking, at the future, sort of what do you think each administration would bring to the table? And do you think there are any similarities in how the, candidate Harris and former President Trump would react to China's increasing aggression?
So the similarities are actually stronger than the differences here.
Yay.
And except that what we have is a very hawkish consensus in Washington. There's a new China narrative, and it's very simple. It's very easy to remember. If I come back here in 5 years, you'll all remember it. The China narrative in Washington goes like this: China, bad. Right? It's about that basic. And this is something, I think one of the things the Trump administration deserves credit for is that they sort of raised the alarm bells a year or two earlier than they would have been raised otherwise. COVID was going to do that anyway.
Yeah.
But the Trump administration had really changed or highlighted this new, much more negative view of China even before COVID. And the Biden administration has taken that on to a considerable degree.
Right.
The difference is that the Biden administration, as the Chinese would note, is more traditional and therefore more consistent and predictable. They don't like harsh rhetoric for the sake of it, just to stick a finger in the eye. But most importantly, what the Biden administration has done is it strengthened our alliances relative to China. Because the first Trump administration, with its tariffs, with its demand that Koreans and Japanese treat our soldiers as mercenaries and pay more for protection. They're now saying that he now says that Taiwan has to pay more for protection. And with tariffs against Europe, against Canada, against steel on security grounds, it was sort of a war of all against all. And it tended to alienate countries all around the world. The Biden administration has actually repaired those and brought a lot of energy to bear, such that he's brought about a tentative reconciliation between South Korea and Japan, which is meaningful. It's got some teeth in it, but it's not that solid yet. Those resentments run very deep. He has built up the Quad, which predated the Biden administration, but they've fleshed it out. And the Quad is the U.S., India, Australia, and Japan working together in various ways to counter China. The AUKUS deal, whereby the UK, the U.S. are working with the Australians to build Australian nuclear-powered, not nuclear-armed, submarines that will be based in Australia, but they're also working on artificial intelligence and tech. We have new bases in the Philippines. We put a lot of points on the board in the Western Pacific because of the attention to alliances. But you'll see far more consistency on China than inconsistency between a second Trump administration or a Harris administration.
And you mentioned this about artificial intelligence and the U.S. withholding some of our most important assets. Now you mentioned that China is developing their own. So in this sort of AI race, where do we fall when we compare ourselves to China?
So we are way ahead in the theory, design of new technologies for artificial intelligence. China was, you may remember ChatGPT appeared seemingly overnight, right? It was a big shock in America. It was a shock in China too. They had thought they were much closer to us, and they're nowhere near that yet. They also handicapped themselves because they're trying to now build Chinese domestic artificial intelligence systems like ChatGPT, and these are basically probability machines that you feed massive amounts of data into them. You want to give them as much of the internet as you can, let the machines learn, feed machine learning with as much data as possible, and then their predictive capacity goes up. China, one, doesn't have as much computing power as it would like to have because of our export controls. We're denying them not only the chips, it's not just that we don't export chips to them. One of the most important companies in the world is a Dutch company called ASML, which uses extreme ultraviolet lithography to etch smaller and smaller down to 2 nanometer, which is infinitesimally small chips. We've also convinced ASML not to sell those lithography machines to China. We have straight-armed the Japanese and the South Koreans who make essential components to deny those to China. So that's one of their problems. The second is their political censorship. They don't want to train their large language models on the entire internet. They don't want somebody to say, what happens if Xi Jinping has keels over tomorrow? They don't want so they have to say, well, that's an inadmissible question. And so they're stymied by their censorship and can't feed as much of the internet to their large language models, and therefore they don't perform as well. But just one quick note, because I've been watching this since the mid-'80s. We've always been wrong about China, and it's always because we underestimated them.
Right.
We've always underestimated them. It's incredibly cultural condescending. I happen to think there's a strain of racism in it. We've always underestimated them. They've tended to always find a way to do it and always surprise us. So the fact that right now they're a little bit on the back foot doesn't mean they will be in a year or two necessarily.
It reminds me of the opening ceremonies in, I think it was Beijing, when they had all of these really elaborate motions, and you're thinking that's got to be mechanical, and then it's humans. They pop out, and they've all been in this
People's
very
Liberation
coordinated-
Army soldiers.
Yes,
to be exact.
Yes. Looking at some of the changes, maybe since the last time you were here, I think China, their economic power has somewhat gone down, especially internally, as they have struggled recently. They have an aging population.
Yes.
Their population suffers, one of the comments in the chat is that they have a high incidence of lung cancer, but only the very wealthy can sort of afford treatment. So is there any sign that the general population in China is starting to push back against the Communist Party? And what are some of those signs, and what should we be looking for internally for some dissidents?
Well, there's an awful lot in that question.
Yeah.
First, it's
I'm
true.
weaving them together. Yeah.
It is true that China is in the midst of its greatest economic crisis since reform and opening began under Deng Xiaoping in 1978. And if, as the skeptics say, China is beginning something like a lost decade of the sort that Japan had, if this is a slowdown which is going to mean that China doesn't escape the middle income trap and become a wealthy country, if this is a slowdown that means China is going to have to dial back its global ambitions, then it's already begun, and it's begun for the reasons that were mentioned. But it's way too soon to make the call, right? I think 2008, we weren't finished in 2008, right. And that was far worse than what they're suffering right now, as far as we know so far. Okay. So yes, there's an ongoing structural economic crisis in China that could have an enormous impact on its national power and national well-being, and it could change this equation, but we don't know that yet. In terms of population pushing back, this I think is a very, very important question. It's very hard to know. Xi Jinping is still very popular, not with intellectuals, not with the educated classes, but he's popular with the People's Liberation Army, with the internal security system, the national policing, which has a bigger budget than the People's Liberation Army. He's popular with the Communist Party. There are 100 million members, and so he's probably popular with a lot of their relatives as well. He's popular with agriculturalists, blue-collar workers, and people in second and third tier cities, so he's pretty popular. But I don't think that popularity means that people understand and approve of where he's taking the country. They like him because he's combated corruption, they think, and in fact he has. He's done other things as well. And because they like that he has increased China's international standing. There's a lot of nationalism. But that doesn't mean that they like where he's taking them. So one of the groups that I do know well is the urban, young, educated class. You know, the hot shots of Shenzhen and Shanghai and Beijing. And they're very patriotic. They love their country. They're proud of their country. But what they want is a China in which people speak approvingly of Beijing and Shanghai and Hong Kong in the same sentence with New York and London and Tokyo and Paris and Milan and Seoul. And Xi Jinping is given them Moscow, Tehran, Pyongyang, and Caracas. You know, that's just not, or just a great old poem. This is a complete digression, but because I know that the seminar is interested in such things. Did John Updike ever speak here? Did you ever get him to Steamboat? John Updike, the author? Well, Venezuela is in the news a lot now, and he wrote a poem about Venezuela which goes, "The cars in Caracas create a recuckus, resounding fracas, taxaxis, and truckus." That's the end of my digression. So what are the people doing? I don't say this to be politically correct, I say it because it's true. Watch the women. They are the change agents in China. They are the change agents. There's no question about this. After many failures, you finally had the first successful Me Too case just this month. Every other has been dismissed out of hand, or the women who brought the case have been attacked in a country that is rife with domestic abuse and sexual harassment. But most importantly, and this was in the question, women, not for political reasons, for personal reasons, have found a way to push back against the Communist Party in the area that matters most. And that is that they are voting with their marriageability and their fertility. Yep. And they are not going to become baby-making machines and solve the demographic crisis. And they've been very clear and very vocal about that. And the reason that the Communist Party can't do anything about this is that women don't have to organize in this way. They just make individual decisions. Yeah. And so, yes, I think we're talking evolution, not revolution, but watch the women.
Fascinating, yeah. Moving into COVID, that was a major event that happened since the last time we hosted you. And so what have been the effects of China's COVID policy, and is that contributing to some of the distance they're seeing?
Well, it started off as a very bad news story for the party because it was widely seen that the party had mishandled the initial outbreak in Wuhan, that they had suppressed accurate information, that they had punished doctors and epidemiologists who were trying to share information. They initially handled it very, very badly. They took a heavy hit for that. But then they came in with that strong zero COVID policy, which meant that despite having not very good vaccines, better than nothing, but not a lot better, but better than injecting Clorox into your veins, So they had, but they didn't have very good jabs, but they had a very stringent kind of policy that only an authoritarian nation could do, such that they actually came out of COVID very, very early. And while we were in our worst phase, and before we got the vaccines, they were having rave parties in swimming pools and were celebrating and doing very well until, was it the Omicron variant?
I think so, yeah.
When their jabs were not very good and they didn't have an answer for that, and it swept through China and went to the most stringent lockdowns, especially in Shanghai. And that taught many Chinese who didn't know it, people who were, say, 50 and younger, who had only grown up in an increasingly wealthy China, of which they were very proud, and in which they had felt themselves to be enabled. This taught them that they actually lived under a capricious government that could do whatever it wanted and that they had no recourse. And some young Chinese started to call China Xi Chaoxian, which means Western North Korea.
Wow.
So then when that happened and you had a weekend of protests, you might remember the white paper protests in which people, they didn't want to have anti-government slogans, so they held up blank sheets of paper. And they still went to prison. But as soon as that happened, Xi Jinping stopped the zero COVID. He said, okay, do whatever you want. The data suggests that well over 1 million Chinese died. They had no plan for that. They still didn't have the beds, the equipment, or the jabs. And then they hoped they would get a post-COVID big economic boost. And instead they got their worst economic crisis in '78.
Which continues now.
Which continues, and the people are very aware of it.
Speaking more about China's influence in Africa, what are the risks that you see of their economic development in the region, and sort of how do we mitigate some of those risks with
I think we need to start
presence?
with the benefits. That's what a lot of the Africans see.
Yeah.
Right? So China has lent, this is not aid, it's sometimes described as aid, but has lent at mostly commercial rates, fairly high rates, a tremendous amount of money to Africa, Latin America, other countries as well, mostly for infrastructure projects, for ports, for highways, for trains, for airports. And a lot of those projects are ultimately aimed at extractive industries, at getting raw materials out of Africa for China, cobalt, bauxite, graphite. But nevertheless, they're building transcontinental and transnational railroads that we're not. So what the Africans would tend to say is, look, China comes with cash on the barrelhead now for real projects that they build, and Americans just come here with moralistic sermons. So where do we think they go? Now, there have been many missteps from the Chinese, and they've been criticized as neo-colonialists. They've been criticized for not doing sufficient environmental impact statements, or for not respecting indigenous peoples, or not doing simple feasibility studies to know if these projects were going to earn enough money to pay them back. And many African countries cannot pay them back. They're hugely indebted. But China's also adjusting its policies. China's not deaf to these criticisms. They do not want what they call their Belt and Road Initiative to fail, because it's central to Xi Jinping's governance. If it fails, Xi Jinping fails. So they're adjusting. And most of their new lending is actually on restructuring of loans, some debt forgiveness. They're taking bigger haircuts. They're hiring more local people. They also do something that we used to do back in the Mansfield Fulbright days that many of you probably remember, which was taking educational diplomacy very seriously. China gives tens of thousands of scholarships every year to African engineers, doctors, to do all of their degree work in China and then go back to Africa. There are 40,000 young Kazakhs in Chinese universities. Wow. We don't do this. So I wouldn't begin with the negative on this one. I think we have to emphasize the benefits that people see from China, the fact that China is adjusting, and then there's where the hell are you, US of A, in all of this. So I think we need to be careful of the form of the question. But yes, it is true that they are in some ways working indirectly through gangs, through child labor, in toxic mines. If you haven't seen, there's been some very good photo essays of what a cobalt or a graphite mine looks like, and how fatal that can be. And a lot of it is extractive industries for China, which is why the Africans have said, you're neo-colonialists. The essence of colonialism was extracting raw materials and then selling back in finished products. And that's what you, China, are doing.
Right.
But China's also trying to adjust. This is a dynamic situation, and the real question is, are we actually going to put any real dollars out the door for meaningful projects?
You talked a little bit about Russia, North Korea, and China, the relationship and the strengthening allyship that they have. In your view, sort of, how do we start to peel apart Russia and China, or is that possible, or are we at a turning point where they are sort of?
I don't think we can peel them apart. A few years ago, there was talk of a reverse Nixon, where this obviously before the invasion, but after the annexation of Crimea, can we draw closer to Russia vis-a-vis China, just as we drew closer to China vis-a-vis the Soviet Union? The answer is clearly no,
right.
Now. And as I said, while there's a long and very complicated history of deep distrust between China and Russia, and it still obtains, because, as I mentioned, China truly believes and reasonably believes that we are an existential threat, they must have a strong partner, and that must be Russia. Right? And because they share this desire not to have their choices shaped by us, that is very powerful medicine. And not just in authoritarian countries, in developing countries as well. In much of Latin America, in much of Africa, that's also very strong. And so as they bring more people into that coalition, more countries like Iran, like more parts of the global south, China wants to not overthrow the existing order, but to provide options, including an optional global telecom system, which, yes, uses Huawei, which can't be sanctioned by us, including an alternate global financial system that we can't sanction, and that does more business in currencies other than the US dollar. That's very hard to do, but a lot of countries are interested.
Right.
And I don't see us peeling away any of the major ones. And again, it's about us being more active in these countries at a time when, say, the Biden administration took a lot from the Trump administration, including taking on its critique of globalization. This notion that globalization has failed for America, it's just the plaything of coastal elites who enrich themselves at the expense of the heartland. It was all a ripoff, and you hear this again from the Biden administration. The measure of a successful foreign policy is factory jobs in Middle America. Factory jobs in Middle America are very, very, very important. But they're not the measure of foreign policy.
Yeah.
Peace and prosperity are the measure of foreign policy. So we actually need to be more globally engaged and to find a new rationale for that is true and that the American people will accept and embrace, or China is going to run the table in the developing world because they bring more to it.
Right. So I think we have time for one more question. I'll forego the TikTok question, but I was thinking, we didn't talk a ton about Taiwan. The question from the audience is, Taiwan, Taiwan, Taiwan. We know the drill, but what is our best strategy going forward to discourage this flashpoint?
Yes. Well, the way the question is phrased suggests that the person knows what I think is the correct answer. So for China, again, you always come back to make sure you understand the Chinese point of view before you start to think about our strategy.
Right.
Right? For China, this is an unfinished civil war, full stop. That's all it is, and it's none of anybody else's business. And there's no good historical analogy for this, but a ridiculous, false historical analogy, work of fiction. I mean, imagine at the end of the Civil War that Jeff Davis and Robert E. Lee and what remained of the Confederate Army had not surrendered, and instead they had gone to Puerto Rico. And there they had continued with slavery and continued with the Confederate States of America, claiming to represent the true spirit of the United States. Right. And imagine further that they'd been able to maintain Puerto Rico as the Confederate States of America to the present day because of the military assistance of Russia. That's silly, I realize. But that's sort of how China feels. Yeah. About Taiwan and our place in it. They have an enormous advantage of proximity. They're right there. It's 100 miles off their coast. They have, I think, an even bigger advantage of will. They care more than we do. That's the position you want to be in, and they know what they're willing to pay for that. But they're not sure of what the costs are going to be. We can't get them to change their claims about Taiwan. What we can do, and what we have done continually since this whole arrangement started, is convince them year on year that this is not yet the time. Okay, so it's a kick the can strategy. You've got to convince them that the costs of going are too high for now.
Right.
That has to be the policy, because the morning we wake up and they've moved with an amphibious invasion or a blockade or whatever it is, that's a very bad morning, because we don't really have an answer for that. And it will show up, we will look, I think, probably extremely ineffectual. So I think that working with our allies, working absolutely through deterrence, but also through diplomacy. We're doing fine on the deterrence side, we're neglecting the diplomacy. We need to keep convincing them to kick the can.
Well, with that, thank you so much, Robert, for this speech tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience. Enjoy your evening. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks.